All right, friends, it's time to give you loyal listeners a discount on protein powder. You may or may not know, but I launched my very first protein powder 2 years ago. It's a grass-fed beef isolate with only 3 ingredients: grass-fed beef, either organic cacao or organic vanilla, and organic monk fruit. Now, if you don't want any of the added flavor and sweeteners, you can also just get unflavored. And no matter what flavor you choose, you're getting over 23 grams of protein per scoop, which is going to keep you full and satisfied between meals. I love starting my day with a Fab4 smoothie and breaking my fast with that much protein. It makes a serious difference in my cravings and blood sugar balance the rest of the day, and I've seen it with my clients as well. Now, I never thought I'd own a product company, but when I got pregnant with Sebastian, I realized the majority of protein powders were chemically extracted or enzymatically extracted, and I wanted to use heat and water only. I wanted minimal ingredients because we don't need those emulsifiers, fillers, or added vitamins, minerals, and probiotics. All of those additions increase the chances that it's not going to work for your body, whether it be bloating, digestion issues. I just wanted pure, clean protein to keep you full and satisfied so you could build the most delicious Fab4 smoothie. And I have to say, I'm pretty proud of the flavor. If you take a look at our reviews on Amazon, you'll see 5-star reviews for flavor. And that is key, because if you don't love your Fab4 smoothie and you don't love drinking your protein powder, you're not going to do it. It won't become a habit, and it's consistency that outpaces everything. So if you're here and you're listening and you want to give our protein powder a try, use the code podcast5 for $5 off your order. And let me know if you love it. My favorite ways to apply this protein powder is in my Fab4 smoothie, making freezer fudge, making chocolate milk, making hot chocolate, and throwing the unflavored into all my kids' baked goods. So let me know how you use it. Let me know if you love it, and share this podcast deal with your friends. Robb Wolf is a 2-time New York Times bestselling author of The Paleo Solution and Wired to Eat. He co-authored Sacred Cow, which explains why well-raised meat is good for us and good for the planet. He's a former research biochemist and one of the world's leading experts in the Paleolithic nutrition movement. Robb has transformed the lives of tens of thousands of people around the world via his top-ranked podcast on iTunes called The Healthy Rebellion Radio and the popular seminar series. Robb has functioned as a review editor for the Journal of Nutrition and Metabolism and as a consultant for the Naval Special Warfare Resiliency Program. He recently co-founded LMNT Labs, which created LMNT, a unique electrolyte drink mix with everything you need to optimize performance and none of the sugar or additives to slow you down. Robb, welcome back to the show. How you doing?
I am honored to bring down property values with you anytime. I'm pretty good.
I love it. And where are you in the world right now? Speaking of property values.
Yeah, we just moved from the middle of the hill country in Texas and New Braunfels to Kalispell, Montana, actually. And we're really digging it. My wife and I grew up in that kind of Northern California, Northern Nevada area, and we never fully appreciated how much mountains and trees and all that, really speak to us. And the hill country where we were for the last 2 years is beautiful. It's really cool, but it's very, very different than the mountains. So we're just getting acquainted with having grizzly bears and mountain lions and all that around us. Like we take our dog on a walk and we bring bear spray with us, and it's an interesting gig. Yeah.
Wow. Getting back to your roots.
Absolutely. It is fully caveman here. Yeah.
I love that. Well, I haven't gone fully into the wilderness. I get my little weekends and weeks up in Mammoth Mountain, but I have actually gone back to my roots too. So I am talking to you from Orange County, California. Kind of pulled myself out of the city, got back to my beach roots, and raising the boys down here. So
awesome.
This is the beauty of the virtual world, is we can have a conversation from all parts of it and get into the nitty gritty. And today, the nitty gritty is going to be all about electrolytes and LMNT, because I'm obsessed and I've been posting about it. And I'm getting a bunch of questions, and I figured we could just do a founders series on it. We could go into the science. You could break down the research for people, because I think salt, obviously, as you know, being the founder of this company, has a really bad reputation.
Right.
And I'd like to dispel that. But let's start from the beginning, because for people who don't know you, for me, you've always been a leading voice, first in the primal world, in the low carb world, in the keto world, like just kind of, I think more than attaching you to a specific lifestyle is just attaching you to the research. You do a really good job of breaking down research and looking at the newest studies. And I've always looked to you as an expert in that. So first of all, thank you for that. But I want to start with your personal journey. Like, what led you to dive deep into wellness and nutrition, and how did you even get to this place where you're sitting today?
Yeah, it's funny. I'm knocking on the door to 50 years old. Like, I've got like 6 months, 8 months until I'm 50. And so this Genesis story keeps getting longer and longer in like the meandering old man fashion that one would expect. So I'm trying to keep that concise, but I've always been really interested in health and human performance. Both of my parents were pretty sick when I was growing up. Both of them smoked. My dad drank. Looking back, my mom had, as long as I can remember, this interwoven, complex autoimmune, kind of scenario going on. And we didn't discover that until my own health crisis in my mid-20s kind of like started peeling all this stuff apart, and we kind of figured this out. But I was a former California state powerlifting champion. I was an amateur kickboxer. I did a lot of different stuff, and I did a biochemistry undergrad and was looking at either a medical school track or a research track. And it was right around this time that my health just absolutely cratered. And 15 years ago, I attributed all of this to my diet at that time, which was a high carb, low fat, vegan diet. And I will say that dietary approach for me is probably not optimum. But if I had moved to Costa Rica instead of Seattle, if I had chosen to be a surf instructor instead of a medical student, I might have navigated things better, but I was sleeping 4 hours a night. I had massive stress. I was of the opinion that, you sleep when you're dead, sleep is for the weak. And so, in fairness, I really was looking back, I did everything imaginable wrong. And wrong being just not all that healthy. I had a basement apartment where the ceiling was about a foot above my head, and it had one window that was north facing next to a house like 5 feet away from me. And I would get up before the sun came up and come home after the sun went down. And I just ended up super sick with ulcerative colitis and a bunch of other problems, some pretty severe depression. And it was around this time that my mother's health problems reached kind of a tipping point. And we discovered that she had celiac disease, rheumatoid arthritis, Sjogren's, and a host of other autoimmune related issues. And when she was relating her symptoms and also what her rheumatologist said, on the celiac front, he said, you can't eat gluten. Like, this is an absolute no-go. I had never heard of celiac before. And then I discovered it was this autoimmune precipitated gluten reaction. And when I looked at everything my mom had experienced and what I was heading into, I'm like, oh, this is me. Like, this is 100% me, And I was at my wit's end. I'm about 165, 170 pounds right now. At the low ebb of my ulcerative colitis, I was about 125 or 130 pounds. So imagine 30 pounds less of me,
You would have looked sick.
I was a mess, my hair was falling out. I was just a disaster. And I was also pretty desperate. And so when I started casting around looking for some solutions, it's kind of a wacky thing that happened, but my mom had been diagnosed that she was reactive to grains, legumes, and dairy. And the dairy part, because I was vegan at the time, I'm like, okay, that makes sense. But the grains and legumes, I just said, what on earth do you eat if you don't eat that? And I was kind of thinking about it and it just free associating. And I was like, okay, grains and legumes, that's like agriculture. Excuse me. What do we eat before agriculture? And this is 1998, mind you. So it's a fair bit of time traveling, but I had heard some term called a Paleolithic diet, and I have no idea where I had heard it, but I went into the house, turned on my dial-up computer, waited for the hamsters to do what they did at that time. And in this newfangled search engine, I put in Paleolithic diet, and I found a little bit of information, but it was really interesting. It really spoke to the observation that lots and lots of people have these GI and autoimmune related issues with what they would call these evolutionarily novel foods. And it suggested kind of a low carb approach. And I jumped into that, both feet, because I I was sick enough, and I knew that the surgery route and the immunosuppressant drug route was really not a good long-term solution. Like, I knew enough about medicine at that time that although that can save your life in a really severe situation, it was not a good solution long-term. And for me, this was a life-saving event. And I've eaten basically kind of a peri-ketogenic low-carb diet for 22, going on 23 years now. And circling back around to this element story, like, I'm fairly good at metabolism. I'm a pretty good biochemist. I understand the metabolism pretty well. I've never been afraid of sodium. Like, I had read the sodium research. I'm like, oh, this is kind of ridiculous. It's a correlative deal. Most people get the bulk of their sodium from eating processed foods. If anybody has an argument that processed foods are a problem at this point, like, you have to question their sanity. But I had kind of dismissed it. And I mentioned this because, you very graciously at the beginning, said that I was kind of an expert in these areas and whatnot. I have some expertise, but it also shows that one can get blindsided by not keeping their mind open and whatnot. And so I had motored along throughout my 22, 23 years of eating low carb and generally felt very good, but I had a really rough time fueling the workouts that I did. I just got a brown belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I was early in the CrossFit scene. And although I could lift weights and do some cardio, low carb fueled, that hard, low gear, that grinding gear, I just didn't have it, and I couldn't figure out, do I need some carbs before workout or after workout? And I was doing all this stuff trying to figure it out. And then I met two guys, Tyler Cartwright and Luis Villasenor, the founders of Keto Gains. And they have this huge online community where they have these just stunning transformations. And the funny thing is, all the colors and the imaging and branding kind of looks like this total like bro fest of working out. But when you look at the community they serve, it's about 85% women between the age of like 35 and 65. And I was like, wow, this is really interesting, And nobody was ending up with adrenal fatigue. Nobody was ending up with, thyroid dysregulation, all these kind of bugaboos that seem to be associated with low carb eating. And people were really crushing things. And they had women competing in jiu-jitsu and CrossFit and all this stuff. I'm like, the heck are these guys doing? And I just kind of, crept into their inner circle, basically just insinuated myself and became good friends with them, learned a ton. And I asked them, can you look at what I'm doing and just give me some feedback? And they looked at it and they're like, hey, this all looks good, but you're really too low in electrolytes, specifically sodium. I was like, oh, no, I'm a biochemist. Like, I've got this. I have it all figured out, So what most people do when they have a world-class coach giving them advice is they ignore it for at least a year, because surely you wouldn't take someone that is leagues above you in like competency and actually listen to them. Of course, you're going to ignore it. And so I motored along for a good year, and they're very kind, thoughtful people, and they didn't just like can me outright, but it was about a year later that I was still bemoaning my situation. And they said, no, really, man, like, weigh and measure your food, put it into Chronometer, because it'll tell you the protein, carbs, fat, but it'll also show the electrolytes, the sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium. And I did it, and I was less than half of the minimum that they recommend for people.
Ooh.
And that minimum, which is about 5 grams a day of sodium, and that minimum for some people is as much as 10 grams of sodium per day, depending on activity level, if you're a really hard sweater and stuff like that. And so I finally upped my sodium, and it was just magic. And it sounds trite and certainly self-serving because I'm a co-founder of this company. So of course I'm going to, spin this thing up as something that's great. But I have to say, when you think about the reality that every thought we have, every muscle contraction, every nerve impulse is driven by sodium potassium pumps, if that is off, then clearly you're going to not feel well. And I've been thinking about this over the 3 years since we founded LMNT. And when you think about the things that our physiology really tightly regulates, pH is probably the most tightly regulated thing in our physiology. If your pH goes too high or goes too low, it can kill you, and you will feel terrible along the way. Arguably, the next most tightly controlled thing is electrolyte status. And if you get and the really interesting thing about that, can get too much sodium, but it's hard to do. The kidneys are very efficient at filtering out the sodium, retaining the potassium and magnesium in the amounts and ratios that we need. But if we are deficient in sodium, it becomes this weird downward spiral where the kidneys will start shedding electrolytes, shedding potassium, trying to renormalize that sodium potassium ratio. And this is where folks can end up hospitalized or even dead from hyponatremia, low sodium levels. So I know that was like a super long, meandering story, but that's where I went from kind of like ancestral health, and then it bridged into this experience of learning that there are experts out there above and beyond myself on a host of topics. And this electrolyte topic was something that, it's just as a quick aside, if somebody is placed on a medically supervised ketogenic diet, those folks will be prescribed at least 5 grams of sodium per day as part of their dietary regimen. But in the popular culture discussion of low carb diets, that is just lost. Everybody focuses on protein, carbs, fat, and how much, fibrous, broccoli accounts for carbohydrates, and nobody talks about the sodium piece. So that's one part of this story. And then the other part of this story is that in the medical scene, kind of writ large, we do have this association between sodium and blood pressure. We know that hypertension is a major factor in cardiovascular disease. And so we had this interesting situation where in a hypercaloric processed food diet that's rich in sodium, the whole combination is bad. But when people shift to a whole food-based diet, whether it's paleo or keto or Mediterranean or what have you, they end up removing virtually all of the natural sodium sources out of the diet. And what most people find is that they need to significantly increase the amount of sodium that they eat, or they feel like garbage a lot of the time. So that's my long, meandering kind of genesis story around all this stuff.
I love it. I love it because what I've experienced and what so many of my clients have experienced, being that I'm obsessed with blood sugar balance, I'm obsessed with whole food diet, I'm obsessed with pulling out the processed foods. You have this, I want to call it like low carb purgatory, where people are like, oh, I feel sluggish, or I feel, I'm worried about my hormones, or I just don't have the gas that I used to have. I really think I need to bring the carbohydrates back. And they're bringing back all the sweet potatoes and all the fruit, and then they're bringing back crackers and tortillas, and they're trying to figure out how to balance it. But what LMNT has done for me and for a lot of my clients, and I felt like I had great energy levels, but I feel like it turned the lights on in a weird way. I just can't explain it. I've had clients tell me that they don't have their cravings anymore that they used to have for sugar and processed foods, that they naturally and easily are keeping those windows between meals that I asked them to keep. It makes fasting easier. It makes, I really think it makes eating a normal amount of food easier. The hydration is different. I can't rave enough about it. That's why you're on the podcast. That's why I gave you my money and invested in your brand. That's why I just, after trying it, it was a kind of a no-brainer for me. So I really want people to understand what electrolytes are, why it's doing what it's doing. So let's go back to the basics. I think people throw around the word electrolyte and they see, and I'm not going to name names because there's a lot of other electrolyte companies on the market, and you have the old school Gatorade style power drinks and stuff like that. Can you talk about what electrolytes are and how they're different from a sports drink or, other packets and powders that are on the market and compared to LMNT?
Yeah. And, just as a quick aside, Gatorade, we had somebody go to they were at Florida State University where Gatorade was developed originally. And they have this museum there. And in the museum, there's some of the original packets of the first runs of Gatorade, and it had 1 gram of sodium per serving. And then over the course of time, the sodium has decreased and the sugar has increased remarkably. So that's just it. I'm going to throw that out there. People can kind of noodle on that, and kind of stew and ruminate on it. But electrolytes fall into a couple of different classes. Some of them are these metal ions, sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium. Then we have these negatively charged ions that go with them, typically chloride, bicarbonate, sometimes some phosphate. And these things control, again, virtually every metabolic function in our body. They're tightly involved with ATP production and degradation, with DNA manufacture, and again, with just the basic production of energy in the body. And what ends up happening at a cellular level is outside of our cells, we tend to have more sodium in concentration. And then inside the cells, we have more potassium. And our cellular machinery is working all the time to keep this gradient. And then when we want to produce energy, the sodium is allowed to rush inside the cell, the potassium is allowed to rush outside the cell. And that potential energy is kind of like if you were to build a hydroelectric dam on a creek, that potential energy of the water being stored behind it and then coming through is the way that we do literally everything, every muscle contraction, nerve impulse. It's literally everything. And again, these levels are pretty tightly regulated. And this is, again, why when folks get particularly low sodium, they feel so bad. One of the first things that happens is people will experience some really significant neurological fatigue and headaches and lethargy. And this is due in part that the potassium, overabundance of potassium, particularly in the brain, you actually get swelling of the brain. And that neurological edema is very dangerous if it goes too far. It's a little bit like what happens in a traumatic brain injury. So when we get out of our normal range, things kind of get bad. But the really kind of cool thing, and this is true whether you use LMNT or you use pickled juice or whether you grab some chicken bouillon cubes or whatever, if you're deficient in sodium, you will feel better within about 5 minutes. Like it starts equilibrating almost immediately. And that's kind of a cool thing from a supplement perspective. You don't have to wait a week or a month and you're like, I don't know, maybe it helped a little bit, maybe it didn't. Like there's some really cool adaptogens out there that I like, rhodiola and things like that. They're cool, but you have to give them a pretty good run. It's about a month, 2 months down the road. And you're like, I think I'm recovering better from workouts. Whereas if you are really off point on electrolytes, getting back on point, you feel better almost immediately. So we were lucky in that regard. Like I think that's been a big part of the success of LMNT in general, is that I think we really got the formulation correct. And again, it's interesting because sodium has been so vilified. People will tend to focus on potassium and magnesium, and those things are absolutely important. And in a modern processed food diet, people are not getting enough potassium and magnesium. But the way that we formulated LMNT, we looked at about 300 people and their dietary logs and, their protein, carbs, fat, but also specifically sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium. And what we found was that people were pretty good on calcium. Like it was pretty rare that folks were deficient in calcium. The magnesium, they were a little bit skinny on, same deal with potassium, but the sodium was off by like an order of magnitude. And so the way that we formulated LMNT was to really specifically address the deficiencies of an otherwise well-formulated whole food diet. You weren't going to go fix a highly processed food diet with LMNT. You're just, it's not addressing the underlying problem, but if somebody is shifted, and again, it doesn't matter whether it's keto or paleo or Mediterranean or really vegan, whatever it is, if they're eating largely whole unprocessed foods, they're probably doing pretty good on most of the electrolytes, except for sodium. And the real difference that we see between a well thought out electrolyte formula versus like some of these energy drinks, you start seeing this kind of kitchen sink approach. Like you see a list of ingredients that's kind of like 15 things long. Oh, it's got vitamin C, it's got zinc, it's got this, it's got that. And for us, under different circumstances, those things may be appropriate, but this is also why we don't include sugar or glucose with our electrolytes. There is some mythology out there that you must have glucose in order to absorb sodium in electrolytes. That's not true. Under certain circumstances, that can be helpful. Like this was studied in scenarios in which people were experiencing horrible, life-threatening GI problems from infectious disease, and adding some glucose to electrolytes can help in that like life-threatening diarrhea kind of scenario. But for the vast majority of people you do. Most people don't need that. And even if some people do need some carbohydrate as part of their electrolyte workout kind of scenario, are we talking about a 6'5" male or a 5'2" female? Are we talking about somebody that's an endurance athlete or a CrossFit Games competitor? And so from person to person, the carbohydrate needs vary massively. And instead of just doing one set amount of carbohydrate, what we do is try to educate people about, well, here's a boundary of what you might need. And glucose tablets or glucose powder off the interwebs costs like 30 cents a pound or something like that. So we're like, go get that and then tinker with this. But what we know you need is more sodium, some potassium, and some magnesium. And so that's what we really, really focus on. So we're really trying to get folks exactly what they need and nothing else. Because I mean, it's this really seductive thing to think, well, we'll throw this thing in and throw, some caffeine or this or that. And it's like, no, let's just keep to exactly the thing that we know that people need. And if you want to put like a chocolate salt in some coffee, so you get your electrolytes, do you want some chocolate salt, some coffee, and some whey protein so that you've got a pre or post workout drink or something? That way folks can really customize this based off of their needs instead of us having like a million different like kind of subcategories of the stuff that we're doing.
I love that. I love that you simplified it. I'm such a proponent of building up something versus having to find something, all these like all-in-one shakes or all-in-one multis or it's like, this isn't right for everybody. And
Right.
Building with the basics and allowing people to really stick to a whole food diet and get back to basics in all aspects of their life, sun, sleep, movement, food. I mean, you're putting out a product that really speaks to me personally because I do like basics and I like building. So I want to break down like for the audience, if this would be right for them, because a couple of the questions that I got when I did a little Element Live, just kind of answering some questions of why I was drinking it all the time, because it really rocked my milk supply. And this time around, it's 4 kids drinking from a fire hose. And I know the second time around, you have more milk ducts, but I mean, I am talking like a pretty major increase in milk supply from Sebastian to Toshin. And I drank it throughout my pregnancy. I felt amazing. I think people think, oh, you shouldn't be drinking that much. Again, shouldn't be drinking that much sodium when you're pregnant. You're going to have edema. Your ankles are going to swell, all the things. And I actually felt like it really made me feel my best. So can we talk about who and what, like the category of people Element would be good for? Some of the questions I got were like, well, if I'm not on a low carb diet, should I have Element? Is it too much for me? Or if it tastes really salty to me, does that mean I already have enough sodium? Those are some of the questions that I got.
Yeah, so. They're really good questions, and it's always hard to know exactly what the answer is for folks, but in general, the lower the carbohydrate intake that folks consume or the lower the glycemic load, then they will tend to need more sodium in particular. So even if you're eating like a whole food-based Mediterranean type diet, it may be like 40-50% carbohydrate, but it's from like peas and lentils and then you're getting good protein sources. You're not low carb, but your insulin load is actually going to be very modest compared to like eating white bread and liquid carbohydrate in the form of sodas and stuff like that. And again, from person to person, this is going to vary. But if people notice that they have some significant lethargy, like late in the day, if they experience any type of like muscle cramping, like you get those toe cramps and stuff like that, like the cramping is actually kind of a late stage warning that like you've really gone too low in electrolytes, most specifically sodium. And again, the irony is that people will look to potassium and magnesium to solve that problem, but it's more the sodium that's really the issue. So if people are, whether they're higher carb or not, if they're experiencing, like the brain fog, the lethargy, the fatigue, then I would at least try it. And again, it could be pickle juice. It could be chicken bouillon cubes. Like it doesn't have to be Element. The only thing that's magical about Element is it's pretty convenient and we really rock the flavors. Like it tastes great. Like that's the only magic there. I really should get better about like, oh no, we have this super secret, source of, sodium from Mars or something, but I just can't do that. But so that's a piece. And then, on the, is it too salty by flavor? that might be an indicator that people are okay. And it might just be that folks might need to dilute it a little bit more. So like my wife will mix this stuff in like 16 ounces of water. And I'm just like, this is undrinkable, but she's Italian and she's just tougher than I am. So but I mix it in like 32 or 34 ounces of water. And that's more my sweet spot. So I think but I do think it's interesting because, and this is where I just don't know what the real answer is, but we have noticed that some folks will mix it up, they'll be drinking it, and it doesn't taste salty at all. And then they'll hit a point where they'll take a sip and they're like, oh, I taste salt now. And it makes me think a little bit of like the zinc tally test when they will assess people whether or not they have adequate zinc, where you'll do like a zinc solution and you do a couple of droppers, you don't taste it. And then one time it tastes like you're chewing on a chrome bumper. And then that seems to suggest that you've actually hit your saturation point. So I don't know what the real story is there. Like, is it just a scenario in which you need to dilute it a little bit more? Or is it really indicating that, nope, you're topped off? And I guess that differential kind of diagnosis on this, if it still tastes salty, but you have muscle cramps and brain fog and lethargy and whatnot, then maybe you just need to dilute it a little bit more, because for your palate, it's still a little bit overpowering. So I would still default to kind of that clinical side. If you're still feeling kind of off, then you probably do still need that electrolyte, infusion in there. Yeah.
I totally agree with you. I was suggesting diluting it. I mean, I drink mine in a 32 ounce Yeti. I'll get halfway through. I love the flavor so much. I'll fill water up on top of it and get an even more diluted flavor for a few more hours. I feel like I can't do a podcast without it. I mean, it just, it is totally a game changer for me. And I sound like a total ad right now, but I just think sodium in general, I just didn't really, I looked to an expert like you look to an even, I guess we call him an even higher expert or bigger expert in that space to, I guess, share the information down the line. Yeah. And for me, it's just been so key in feeling really good. And obviously having a lot of energy throughout my pregnancy and a lot of breast milk supply. Can we talk a little bit about pregnancy and breastfeeding? Yeah. And I think one of the questions I get is it safe? And how many can I have? How many can you have if you're pregnant or breastfeeding? Or how many can you have if you're just a regular dude?
Yeah. I'll circle back to the pregnancy and breastfeeding really quickly, but like the whole advertorial thing, we've been pretty sensitive about that. And so what we've done, we have this downloadable guide where we walk people through how to make their own element at home. You do this much salt and this much no salt and this much potassium or magnesium citrate and then lemon juice and flavor it. And we have some guides on how to the proper amount of like chicken bouillon cubes and pickle juice. So we just mainly want to make sure that people are addressing their sodium issues. We're comfortable in the idea that if people just try LMNT, it tastes good enough and it's convenient enough that people will, by and large, purchase it. And so it's been a really cool position that like the more freebies that we put out there, the more ways that we empower people to just make sure that they're on point with their electrolytes, then typically the better we do. So that's been really cool. And the breastfeeding topic is one that was not remotely on our radar. And it was maybe a year after we had launched. Like we were still pretty obscure, but we started just getting tagged like crazy in these online breastfeeding mom forums. And like there's all these different categories. It's like exclusive pumping and then, pump and feed. And like there's all these different, kind of tribes that folks got into. But the exclusive pumping moms started tagging us like crazy. And there were these pictures of like, your standard little bottle. And there was just a tiny little bit. And the mom would say, this is what I did yesterday. I had some LMNT today. And then there's like 4 or 5 bottles full. And it was a big enough deal that the dean of the School of Epidemiology at Vanderbilt, she's an MD, PhD, she looked at this and she's like, oh, this is huge. And we actually, right before COVID, had a feasibility study looking at breast milk production and LMNT. and then that thing got sidelined. It looks like it's going to start spinning up again, but it was profound enough that she was like, this is something we really need to look into. And when you just look at the kind of physiology behind it, breast milk production clearly is very fluid dependent. Like we want fluid volume in our body. It goes through our circulation. Part of that circulation makes its way through the breast tissue and is involved in the milk production. But the thing about that is just drinking water doesn't influence that. You need the water and the electrolytes. In a textbook of medical physiology, hydration means water and electrolytes. And somewhere along the line, hydration became just water, and that doesn't address it. And simply drinking more water may actually decrease breast milk production, because again, if we get that ratio of sodium to potassium out of balance, it won't allow for the kidneys to do what they should do. It won't allow for the breast tissue to do what it should do, because if that sodium potassium ratio gets out of whack, the person can get sick or they can die. So like it just simply drinking more water doesn't necessarily ensure improved breast milk production, but adequate hydration with water and electrolytes virtually guarantees that increase in production. And as an aside, it's interesting that adequate sodium will suppress cortisol production. So it decreases stress, and stress antagonizes breast milk production. It tends to reduce epinephrine, which is another stress hormone, which antagonizes breast milk production. Properly timed sodium near bedtime improves sleep, and the sleep quality improves breast milk production. So there's all these different synergistic ways that it can really improve that. And you asked, or folks are asking the $1 million question, how much of this do I need? And unfortunately, this is the most difficult thing for me to answer. And again, do we have a 4'8" mom who's, breastfeeding? Do we have a 6'2" mom? Is the 6'2" mom doing 6 CrossFit workouts a week, and she happens to live in Costa Rica or something, and it's 90 degrees and 94% humidity? Or do they live in the mountains here? And if they do live in the mountains, are they at 3,000 feet elevation like me, or are they at 9,000 feet elevation where the air is shockingly dry and it can double your hydration needs? So there's just a massive variation on that. And it kills me, because this is, again, our most common question, like how many of these can I or should I do? And it's really hard to pin that down. Like I wish that I had just a one size fits all answer. I will say that the way that I try to tackle this is kind of bracketing 2 sides of this. And the first part is looking at some research on all-cause mortality in type 2 diabetic heart patients. And what they found was that the low ebb of all-cause mortality was lowest at about 5 grams of sodium intake per day. If people consumed less than that, like the 2,000 milligrams, which is the recommended guidelines by the American Medical Association, all-cause mortality was higher. It was worse. And then what was interesting was that you had to get up to nearly 10 grams of sodium per day in these type 2 diabetic, heart patients to have as much morbidity and mortality as what you had at 2 grams per day. So we kind of feel like that 4 to 5 grams per day. And again, we're not saying you take 5 sticks of LMNT. We're saying from your total dietary intake is somewhere around like 5 grams of sodium per day. And if it's from whole unprocessed foods, you will get the bulk of the magnesium and potassium that you need, for the rest of that. The upper end of this is interesting. The American Council of Sports Medicine has a guideline that for athletes training in hot, humid, or high altitude environments, they start the discussion at 7 to 10 grams of sodium per day. So there's somewhere in that realm, 5, maybe 4, up to 7 to 10, depending on how large you are, your physical activity, heat, humidity, dry air, altitude, all those different things. So I know that that's a really big variation. But again, the easy part to this is just that if folks are eating a largely whole, unprocessed diet, and they have any of these symptoms that we talk about, the brain fog, lethargy, food cravings, cramping. And again, cramping indicates that somebody has gone way far down the track. They should have been supplementing earlier than that. But if you get any of that and you consume some electrolytes and it improves, then you needed it. And so you just kind of titrate based off of that whole process.
I love it. I think that when I get the comments back, 1 gram of sodium, that's so much sodium. And to know that the conversation starts at 4 or 5 grams and goes all the way up to 10 really can kind of let people take a deep breath. Unless you're pulling through Mickey D's for every single meal and you are actually leaning into a whole food diet, this is probably going to make you feel great.
Yep.
And for me personally, I started with like a half or 1 when I was pregnant. And then I just felt great with 1. And I think maybe 1 or 2 days I went up to 2. Really when I had got my Peloton, my push present in my 3rd trimester. I was
nice.
like, I'm going to get this early because I need to get moving. And I just needed to like move my body in the COVID world outside of like what we were doing outside at the beach. But with a toddler sleeping. But then after, when I went to breastfeeding, and in my postpartum stage, there are days I absolutely have a full one, but there are days where I have to use my brain all day and I have multiple podcasts and I just feel amazing on 2. And I have no problem with it. I don't find that my rings actually spin better when my electrolytes are in balance. And so I don't know, I personally feel like I feel fine having 2, but I think I just have been living the low carb lifestyle, whole food diet for so many years that I just was in the dark on the sodium piece.
And most people they'll have an experience like they'll remember when they've gone, say, like hiking and their arms are swinging and it feels like their hands have kind of blown up into balloons. And what's happening there is that folks are inevitably just consuming water and they're actually in a hyponatremic state. They're in a situation where the sodium is too low, the potassium is too high, and that is arguably the main driver of that edema. And you can end up with some edema problems in folks that are hyperinsulinemic, type 2 diabetic, peri-diabetic, and whatnot, because in that high insulin environment, we tend to upregulate the production of a hormone called aldosterone, and that aldosterone will hold sodium and it will increase fluid volume. But this is where folks just need to adopt a largely unprocessed whole food-based diet. And we fix that problem. Again, it doesn't matter whether it's keto or Mediterranean or whatever, if we fix that, then the edema that was caused by elevated insulin and blood sugar levels is addressed. And then interestingly, it tends to increase our sodium needs, not decrease it. It's not 100% across the board, but man, it's pretty close. We do see occasionally some folks that are really sodium sensitive hyper responders. They will see an uptick in their blood pressure with the consumption of sodium, even when they're on a low carb diet. But I think that this is kind of like a 1 in 10,000 kind of phenomena. And interestingly, these folks don't really experience the brain fog, the lethargy. They just hear about something like LMNT. They're like, oh, it sounds great. I'll try it. But for them, it's not really that necessary. They don't, again, from the clinical side, they're not experiencing the problems, so they don't necessarily need it to the same degree.
Yeah, definitely. Can we break down the ingredients a little bit? Just address the sweetener you use, the flavoring. Those are some questions that I've gotten personally because there's a lot of noise on the internet. So I'd love for you to just talk about what's in the product. I'm obsessed with the watermelon salt and the citrus salt because the citrus salt takes me back to my club soccer playing days and the green Gatorade that actually used to taste salty. So I remember it being salty, but these are obviously, they have flavors and you're using a sweetener. Can we just break it down?
Yeah. And, really quickly before I dive into that, when we were thinking about all this stuff, we knew that out in the interwebs, there are folks that it didn't matter what flavor we used, what sweetener we used, it wouldn't be correct for them. And so my wife actually came up with the idea of our raw unflavored, because then it's like, whatever your restrictions are, this one's fine. It's sodium chloride, potassium chloride, magnesium citrate. Like that's it. And those things are all present in the other formulas, but we use stevia as the base when we looked at potential GI problems from things like erythritol and whatnot. Like the stevia seemed to be the cleanest dirty shirt of any of the sweeteners that we could use, and again, it never makes everybody happy. It's impossible to do that. And that's where either the raw and flavored is an option, or you can use our make it yourself and blend it the way you want to, so we do all those things. And then, it's funny, like on the natural flavors, people will get kind of cranky about that. They're like, well, why aren't you just honest about this stuff? Within the flavor profile of watermelon alone, there's like 60 different naturally occurring chemicals. Like I think there's something like 4,000 different chemicals in a watermelon, And so here's a funny aside. Part of the reason why you say natural flavors is that the sourcing isn't always 100% the same, but the chemical ratio ends up being the same. And I know people will get freaked out about like, oh my God, chemicals. As a chemist, in our world, we have matter and energy. If it's matter, it's made out of chemicals. Now, we're not talking about synthetic chemical fertilizer or anything like you've got a bunch of trees outside of me, and each one of these trees has thousands of different chemicals inside of them. Some of them are good for us, some of them are bad for us, but they're made of these chemical constituents, and something folks don't often appreciate. So like the taste of watermelon and the taste of cucumber are actually very similar because they're actually very closely related botanically. And so some of these batches may get some flavor extracts a little bit from cucumber, and sometimes it may be directly from watermelon, and sometimes it may be a combination of both. And that extends to like the citrus. You can extract the same constituents from orange peel or lemon peel or lime peel or a host of different citrus sources. So the long and short is that we quality control every single batch. We look for heavy metals. We look for like fungal contamination. We do QA, QC up the wazoo on the stuff, quality assurance, quality control to make sure like I drink this stuff, my kids drink this stuff. So, we want to be comfortable on all that. So that's kind of the broad brushstrokes, I think, on the flavors, the formulations. And again, we knew that it was going to be impossible to make everybody happy. And again, this is why we have a make it your own formulation. If you like your Himalayan whatever salt and you want to use this one for, this source of potassium citrate instead of potassium chloride, just use that basic template and then mix it yourself. But if you want something that tastes really good and is really convenient, then by all means, we're probably a good option there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I had that same problem when I launched my protein powder. I launched, like your wife, I launched an unflavored grass-fed beef isolate, and I didn't have the vanilla or cacao or the monk fruit in it because there's just going to be someone who doesn't do well with monk fruit. They get headaches. Right. There's going to be someone who doesn't do well with stevia. It's not, you can't really be everything to everyone. Someone's going to get a food intolerance test that says they're allergic to cacao. They're never going to be able to, have this until they fix their gut. Like there's obviously, you can't be one size fits all, but I love that you have the raw and flavored. And I love that you're giving people an option to make stuff at home, because the ultimate goal is that we feel whip smart. We're ready to go. We're functioning at a high level. We don't have the fatigue that we've had. We don't have the cravings, and we feel great. So you're doing that. So thanks for addressing that, just because I know that's something that's going to come up, and I can always trust you to come right through with, just calling the kettle black.
Right. Well, and people feel like we're being slippery on that stuff, but I mean, here's just a possibly interesting aside. Within FDA food labeling guidelines, the malic acid that's part of the magnesium malate is chemically a carbohydrate, but it's such a small amount, we don't even technically need to list it nor the calorie value on our label. It's small enough that we could, within the squirrely FDA guidelines, just ignore that, but we don't. We put it in there, and every once in a while it creates grief. Some ketogenic diet people are like, this thing has 2 grams of carbohydrate. And it's like, yeah, it does. And we're honest about it. And we're going to be transparent, because it is also, in this day and age, it's pretty easy to go grab a product, ship it to a third-party lab and say, hey, what's really in this thing? And what we claim and our disclosures and everything is always going to be what folks are going to find if they were to ship it to a third-party validation. Yeah.
So important. It's so important to have complete transparency. And you guys have done that. You mentioned that your kids drink it, and Sebastian drinks it too. He calls it lemonade. He asked me if because he knows at some point in the day, this Yeti is going to have element in it, or it's going to have just water. It depends on when he wants to grab it and sip it. And I love that he drinks it. He eats the way we eat. So he's having he has a animal protein diet, lots of veggies, lots of leafy greens. Like the kid eats salads. He has nuts and seeds and coconut chips and plantain chips. He's not a low carb kid, but he definitely eats what we eat. So that's,
right.
It's like looking at his plate. There's a lot of protein. There's a lot of veggies. And he's eaten that way his whole life because I refuse to make more than one meal.
Right.
That's just me. And I figured if I just introduced it this way and this was his normal, that I wouldn't have to fight him. And I'm sure there'll be a point where, and I know there's been holidays, he's had, like a sucker for Easter or whatever. And he's like, Mom, this is really good. And I'm like, I know, bud. I know.
If it was dipped in cocaine, it couldn't be any tastier than what it is. Yeah.
But yeah, talk to me about your daughter's drinking it and kind of when are you guys all drinking it? Is there a perfect time to drink it? Are we drinking it in the morning? I know you mentioned the chocolate and the coffee and having it before bed if you're breastfeeding. Like, iterate with me on when we should be drinking this and including it in our diet.
Yeah, it maybe speaking to what our family does might be helpful in that. My wife and I usually do a cup of coffee straight out of the gate that's just coffee. And then once we work through that, then we'll do the chocolate salt in coffee. And I actually do a little bit of whole cream with that one and a little bit of MCT oil because I'm getting close to breakfast time by then. So I'll mix all of that stuff up. For the girls, they definitely do it. They do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu 2 or 3 times a week. And it's an hour and a half. And like, man, they get after it. Like their gis are wet when they're done. So they definitely get after it. And we just mix up in 32 ounces of water, a stick pack of the LMNT. And we usually have a couple of their water bottles mixed up in the refrigerator and we just let them self-regulate on that. We just tend to dilute it more, but it's interesting. Like they'll go to the fridge and sometimes they do some LMNT and sometimes they go to the sink and they do some water. And the cool thing is that I try to find things that they will auto-regulate with it. And just as a quick aside, we found like some of the Lily's dark chocolate. The girls like it, but they won't smash a whole bar of it. Whereas like at Halloween, like they got a hold of like some Hershey's and different stuff like that. And it was, I don't know if you've watched the Fantastic Mr. Fox, where like the fox eats something and there's just like food particles flying everywhere. And it's like that, And so what we try to do is find things that the kids can self-regulate. And so like we do some Rebel ice cream. It's a low carb ice cream. They will go scoop that up and they're totally good. But if they get a hold of like some Haagen-Dazs or something like that, like they will eat all of the container and then all of another container. And so what we're trying to do is just have good options for them across the board, in the totality of the food, so that there's not this weird thing of like, well, you can have this or you can't have that. It's like, have as much of that as you want. But we try to find it compositionally to be these things that they will just kind of auto-regulate with it. And so that's true of the LMNT, and that's true of kind of the rest of the stuff that we mainly have in the house. And we experience the same thing. We'll do some birthday parties and stuff like that. And they get a hold of some other things and they're like, man, this is really good. And I'm like, yeah. And if we had that in the house, how would any of us do with that? And both of them are like, oh, we would just eat it all the time. Yeah, exactly. And so like and I really try not to call it like treats or emotionalize it or anything. It's like, there's just some stuff that like they make it taste so good. I talk to my kids about the hyperpalatability of food, and that there are scientists that try to figure out how to make this potato chip so tasty and snap and crunch, and it's making my mouth water even talking about it,
Yeah.
And that it's literally impossible to not eat the whole thing. And so do we want that type of fight, for ourselves or for them? And they get it. It's pretty cool. They definitely get it. So I didn't want to divert too far off into that, but that's kind of how we try to manage all of this stuff.
When you keep the sugar down and there's like a good source of fat in there, they self-regulate. The Rebel ice cream that you're talking about, I've used with clients who have an ice cream obsession. I've had the cookies and cream and that's delicious. But eating Evolve, those almond butter cups that are like keto cups, those are in our fridge all the time. And if Bash wants one, the great part, it's food. Like it's not, I don't look at that and go like, oh, that's a treat or that's candy because there's no sugar in it. It's almond butter and cacao. And if he wants that like after nap and he's scooting out front, I'm like, yeah, sure, bud, you can have one. Like
Yeah.
Cool. Like that's the cool part about like having that type of diet around. So back to in your coffee, after you have your chocolate in your coffee, are you using another one throughout the day, or is there?
I'm a pretty high consumer. Yeah. And like we do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu 2 to 4 times a week. We work out on some of the other days. I mean, we're not like total workout fanatics, but I'm definitely like kind of a super sweater. Like I think I could lose like 10 pounds of water in a session. And so I definitely find that I do it a lot. Nikki is somewhat similar in that regard. So like I'll usually do some sort of a podcast, and I may do like 2 or 3. And I will home brew some of this stuff too. Like I have a 64-ounce mason jar that I will use lemon juice or pomegranate juice or something as a base and just kind of like home brew that so that I've got some other variety there. But I find that I drink this stuff up till the point where I don't really notice feeling better with it. And then I might have some water or, something like that. But I'm definitely a high consumer on it. Like it's probably 3 to 4 grams and 3 to 5 grams in the form of like a stick pack or stuff that I home brewed per day. But I'm also pretty active and just kind of running and gunning a lot. So yeah.
I love it. So what about, I want to touch on your podcast because I love it. I'm a huge fan of the Healthy Rebellion Radio. But before we get there, can we talk a little bit about homebrew and when someone would want to add some form of glucose or mix up something, and who's right for that?
Yeah. So I'll use myself as an example. I keep some glucose tabs in my bag that I take to jiu-jitsu, and they're just like, you go to the diabetic section of a CVS or whatever. They're kind of horrible because they have like red dye number 5 and all this stuff, but you could get probably better options elsewhere. But I will take 2 elements to jiu-jitsu. One of them I sip on during our drilling part of the class. And then when that's done, we have a 1 or 2 hours of just open mat where a 5-minute timer goes and you roll with one person for 5 minutes and then a minute break and another person. And it's pretty, you're basically doing interval training for like an hour or 2 hours doing that stuff. And somebody's trying to choke you in the process. And so I'll sip on another one during that time. And when we get ready to do the open mat, I'll kind of look around at who's there. And if it's a bunch of beat up old has-beens like me, I just drink the electrolyte plain. If it's a bunch of like 24-year-old police officers that were D1 wrestlers and stuff, then I'll do somewhere between 10 and 20 grams of glucose per hour while I'm doing that harder training. And that seems to be a pretty good bracket for most people. Like even if you just look at some of the guidelines on the interwebs around like cycling, like if you're doing hill repeats or hill intervals or something like that, it's somewhere in that like 10 to 20, 10 to 40 grams of glucose per hour. And the interesting or the cool thing about the tablets, each one of them is 5 grams of glucose. So I can really precisely measure out what I need. And it's completely separate from what I put in here. So like, let's say I did my mix of electrolytes and I start the class because it's a bunch of old beat up has-beens. And then like 3 of the knuckle draggers show up and I'm like, oh God, I need some more energy, And so then I can go over and just grab some glucose tabs. And so I keep them 100% separate. And some people like mixing the glucose in there, but I just really like the flexibility. I know I need the electrolytes. I know with less certainty the amount and the timing that I need on the glucose. And so in that way, I can keep it really simplistic, the way that I kind of address that. And we've worked with people that have been to the Olympics, that are UFC competitors, and we use the same strategy with them. We just really like kind of separating that stuff out so that we can address electrolytes as one need and then kind of like glucose as an entirely different need.
I love it. Always learning from you. Especially now that you have your Healthy Rebellion Radio too. So can you tell, before we go, I want listeners to know where they can follow along and kind of talk to me a little bit about your Q&A format.
Yeah, it's funny. The Q&A format was part of my original podcast ages ago called the Paleo Solution. And it was kind of a response to the deluge of questions that I received. Like I got all these questions and writing a response. First, it was just answer the person directly in an email. And then I started shifting into, oh, this would make a good blog post. So I would do a blog post about it. And then I figured out that I can talk at 400 words a minute and type at 15 words a minute. So there's a clear, disparity there. And it ended up getting my wife involved in this because she helped me co-found the fourth CrossFit affiliate gym in the world. She was the 17th place CrossFit Games finisher. She's been a serial entrepreneur too. She was a co-founder of a tech company. She's a mother to 2 kids. So she's got a really deep bench of experience. And I would honestly be living under a bridge were it not for suckering her into marrying me. And when you look at her and you look at me and you're like, how did she do so poorly? The basic story behind that is that at Chico State University, there's 5 women for every 1 man. And so it's literally like, how long is your arrest record? Oh, it's not that bad. Okay, I guess you're the winner. But yeah, we love doing this Q&A format because we're able to she knows a lot of this stuff, but she also has a real depth of experience in a ton of different areas. So she's able to bring that in, and we have a ton of fun breaking each other's ovaries or balls respectively while we're doing the show. So we have a ton of fun with it.
Yeah, you guys are so fun to follow along with. And I think what I love about your show, which is it's just you can kind of go down a number of different rabbit holes based on the question. And I mean, the topics are always really interesting and they come from listeners. So it's like someone's been following along. They've cleaned up their diet, their whole food, they have a primarily whole food diet. They're locking in sleep and activity and they want to level up. And like you, leveling up with sodium, like me leveling up with LMNT, you're giving them the tools to do that. And it's opened my eyes to certain things where I'm like, oh, that could be an issue for a client, or I don't know. It's just sometimes we learn, or I think I learned personally from client stories and real world experience with a client.
Yeah.
And especially when it's something that I haven't dealt with prior, it's like, you can go to school, but when you get in the real world and start working with clients and they have real issues and you're seeing their blood tests and trying to kind of look at the whole picture and find out what the root cause is or, what the problems are, it's the stories that really help.
Yeah. And I always say, and it sounds kind of trite, but I always say that I stay relevant because I have the smartest people in the world asking questions, which are the folks that listen to our show, but I mean, it really is true. They are kind of a nerdy, well-educated bunch, and they constantly kind of nibble at the edges of what we understand, what's known and what's not known. And then also there's this other piece that, here's just a really quick example. People will ask the question, should I do caffeine? Yes or no? Like, will it affect my sleep? Yes or no? When you look at the half-life of caffeine, the toxicology textbooks say that, the average person in this bell curve takes 8 hours to go for, if you consumed 100 milligrams of caffeine, 8 hours later, you've got 50 milligrams of caffeine, and then 8 more hours, it's 25. So it takes 8 hours to clear half of it. Some people can clear that amount of caffeine. Their half-life for caffeine is 4 hours. And other people, it's as long as nearly 36 hours. So some people will say, I drank coffee yesterday and it still has me awake today. And they are a super slow metabolizer of caffeine. And their friend next to them may be a super fast metabolizer of caffeine, where they have like a double espresso with dinner and they go lay down and go to bed and it's completely cleared out of their system. They're like Wolverine, like they just crush this stuff. And what I find going forward is we have these big picture heuristics: good sleep, circadian rhythm, get sun on your skin, whole unprocessed food. And that will get 95% of people, 80% to the bullseye. But then there's all this customization. There's all this individual story. And what the weird thing for me is the interwebs seem to play to both of those in a really weird way. On the one hand, they'll either say that the big picture story is the whole story, and then you have no opportunity for nuance or customization, or people are so far out in the weeds that anybody new just saying, hey, should I reduce carbohydrate or that people are talking about like ApoE genotypes and XYG amylase gene, and the person is just blown out of the water. And that stuff's important, but it's not the place to start with. So we really to the degree I've remained relevant, it's been because we've had great folks asking questions, and that has driven me to go forward and look at, how can I have a simple story that gets the bulk of the people moving in a good direction, and then how can we shift gears to be able to sort and shuffle people so that we can individualize and customize for their unique needs.
I love it. That's exactly what it is. You're getting you have the audience that's 90% to that bullseye, and all their little stories help listeners iterate in their own life and customize in their own life based on whether the question asked was by someone like them, which is super cool. Right. It's a great way. Yep. It's a great way to get personalized information in a group setting. So
yep, absolutely.
It's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Robb, as always, this was such a pleasure. I'm super excited. Thank you for coming out with this. As much as I'd want to do a home brew, I think with the two little bros I have living here rent free,
right?
I don't know that I'm out in the garage making my own witch's brew of this. You've made it easy and it's changed my life. So thank you for that. And I know it sounds like a shameless plug, but he's not paying for this, so so it's not. But thank you again. And where can people follow along? What can they expect from you next? What's in your world right now?
Oh gosh, follow along. I do a lot of writing for LMNT, so drinkelement.com. I put a lot of material over on the blog there. Probably the main offering I have at this point is the podcast, the Healthy Rebellion Radio. We do have a Healthy Rebellion community where folks will hang out over there, but I have some social media accounts, but I write some stuff up, give it to my assistant. She posts it. I've just kind of the toxicity of social media has reached kind of a breaking point for me. So even though I'm still very interested in helping as many people as I can, it's a one-way broadcast there. Like if people want to interact, they can come over to the Healthy Rebellion, or they can write into the radio, and we'll that's where we'll start having a conversation. But that's what so you won't find me too many other places. Yeah, you will find something that has my image, but not actually me there. Yeah.
I like it. I think that's good. It's called boundaries, and you're creating them for yourself and your family. And there's no need to be sucked into a toxic spiral with trolls and negativity. And it's just, that's not the life we're supposed to live. So keep it positive, keep it with your community, keep helping people. You're changing lives. I appreciate you so much and your time. Thanks, Robb.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you for listening to Be Well by Kelly. Please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Learn more at bewellbykelly.com and follow me on Instagram at bewellbykelly. I would love if you picked up my books, Body Love and Body Love Every Day. They're sold on Amazon and at all major booksellers.